For years, my mother belittled me, throwing cutting words and believing she would always hold power over me. But when I won $1 million, I made a choice. I helped her friend and those who truly deserved it, while leaving my mother with nothing but emptiness and silence. The harshest revenge turned out not to be in quarrels or accusations, but in complete indifference. Hi, this is Arena of Revenge. Here you'll find exciting stories with gripping plots and vengeance. Follow us. My name is David, and I'm 32 years old. I was born and raised in a small town in Ohio, where almost everyone knew everyone else and where rumors spread like wildfire. Ever since I was a child, I felt like my mother treated me differently than others. She was always cold, as if I was always getting in the way of her desire to live her life. When I was little, I'd often hear her say taunts like, "You'll never amount to anything," or "Look at yourself, you're embarrassed to even go to school with a son like that." These words stuck in my mind, and each time I wondered why my own mother so openly despised me. I tried to do well in school, hoping she'd notice and say something kind, but instead of praise, I heard taunts like, "So what if you got an A, you'll still be a nobody." As I got older, her attitude didn't change. At graduation, she told a neighbor that her only hope was that I'd find some kind of job, just so I wouldn't be a burden on her. I got a job in a warehouse, then in a car repair shop, then as a truck driver. Life wasn't easy, but I didn't complain. I harbored resentments but kept them bottled up. The only person who always treated me warmly was Julia, my mother's friend. They'd been friends since school, but unlike my mother, Julia was a good listener. When I was a teenager, she'd sometimes take me for walks or just talk to me, asking how I was doing. These were the rare moments when I felt like someone actually cared about me. My mother, however, continued to wear me down with her words. When I rented my first apartment, she said, "Let's see how many months it takes for you to get kicked out for non-payment." When I brought a girlfriend home, she smirked, "I wonder what she sees in you." When we broke up, she seized the opportunity to add, "Well, I told you no one needed you." At some point, I stopped trying to earn her approval. I started living on my own, working, meeting up with friends occasionally, but the feeling of being betrayed as a child never went away. Everything changed by chance. I'd never been a gambler, but one day on my way home, I stopped at a store and bought a lottery ticket. Just like that, without hope, more for fun. When I scratched off the protective layer and saw the win, I couldn't believe my eyes for a long time. $1 million. For me, it was like a bolt from the blue. I checked several times, called the hotline, looked at the ticket again. It was real. I understood that now I had the opportunity to change my life. The first thing that came to mind was to prove my mother wrong. But the more I thought about it, the less I wanted to spend a cent on her. I remembered all her words, all the mockery, all the coldness with which she had lived next to me for 32 years. Surprisingly, at that moment I thought not of her, but of Julia. She was having a hard time. Her husband had died a few years ago, and she was supporting the house and her son, a student, alone. When I visited her, I could see how difficult it was for her, how tired she was, but she always had a kind word for me. I decided that she was the one I would help. I bought her a new car because her old one was constantly breaking down. I paid for her son's college education so he wouldn't have to worry about loans. I even helped her with the renovations to the house, which had long needed investment. For her, it was like a miracle, and for the first time in my life, I had seen someone so sincerely grateful to me. My mother found out about everything a few weeks later. She called me furiously, demanding an explanation for why I had scattered money into other people's pockets when she had so many problems. She screamed that I had to think about my family first, and for the first time in my life, I answered her calmly, without shouting, without offense. I said only one thing: "For years, you gave me only words. Now they are all you will have left." And I hung up. From that moment on, I no longer answered her calls. She tried through neighbors, through relatives, but I was firmly decided. She would not get my money. She had years to support me at least once, but she chose otherwise. For her, I had always been a loser and let her remain with that thought. And for the first time, I felt like I was living my own life and that I was free. After I won $1 million and helped Julia instead of my mother, life seemed to have returned to normal for the first time, but I quickly realized that this road would have too many twists and turns. Mom was not going to accept the fact that I left her penniless. At first, she just called, texted, and left voicemails, all repeating the same thing: that I was an ungrateful, heartless son who had cut his own mother out of his life. I didn't answer, but she knew that silence hurts more than words. I held on, but one day, things got out of hand. That morning, Aunt Linda called me. We rarely spoke, but now her voice was cold and hard. She claimed that my mother, in tears, had told everyone that I had abandoned her to her fate, even though I now had more money than I could handle. Linda accused me of being a disgrace to the family, of being overwhelmed by the money, and of a normal son caring for his mother first. I listened silently, realizing that my mother had begun to use her relatives as weapons. A couple of days later, my cousin Steve called. We had gotten along well before, but now his tone was completely different. Steve hinted that their family had never been wealthy, that he had 3 children, that they were struggling too, and that since I was so well off, I could help them too. I felt like they were trying to corner me with each such request. First my mother, then my relatives, and then the neighbors would join in. I told him I didn't owe anyone anything and hung up, but it didn't end there. My mother went even further. She went to see her great uncle George, who always loved to dispense advice. A few days later, he came to my house, knocked on the door, and began a long conversation right there on the threshold. He said that my mother was old, that she had been through a lot, that it was hard for her, and that I, as a son, was obliged to support her. He appealed to my pity, to my conscience, and tried to evoke a feeling of guilt. I stood and listened, but inside I was seething. I remembered how this same mother had told me for years that no one needed me. Where was her concern then? Why had none of them protected me from her words? Why was everyone now pretending not to know what she was like with me? George noticed my silence and said that if I didn't change my mind, the whole town would think of me as a callous egotist. These words hurt, but I firmly replied that it was better to be selfish than to let my life be trampled on again. He left, but a week later a new wave began. I started noticing the looks my neighbors gave me whenever I left the house. At the store, at the bar, at the gas station. It was as if everyone knew the same story, only I was the main villain. Rumors spread fast. My mom told everyone that I'd gotten $1 million and abandoned her in my old age, penniless, portraying myself as the victim. And the worst part was, many believed it. Even people I hadn't spoken to in years were messaging me. Some asked for help, some shamed me, some flat out told me I'd lost my humanity. And each time I felt like my mom, like a skilled director, was orchestrating an entire campaign against me. But the worst part was, she exploited my own vulnerabilities. One evening, I went over to help Julia fix her water heater, and my younger cousin Michael was there. He was sitting on the porch, waiting for me. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and at first he spoke softly, as if in a friendly way. But then he started trying to persuade me. My mother was sick, that she had high blood pressure, that she cried at night, that I had driven her to her grave. I looked at him and realized that he was repeating not his own words, but the words my mother had implanted in his head. It was the most painful thing, to see how she was turning the family into an instrument of pressure. I went home angry, but also broken. I began to doubt whether I had done the right thing. Maybe I should have given her at least a little money just to put this matter to rest. But every time I imagined her taking my money, a wave of anger rose inside me. She didn't deserve a cent. And yet the pressure grew. Relatives called almost every day. Some came in person. My mother made scenes in church, where she told everyone that I had left her with nothing. I felt like a man under siege. But at some point, I realized, if I broke now, I would remain a hostage to her will. This was my first real test. Would I be able to defend my life and my decisions, or would I allow her to control me again? After all the calls, threats, and pressure, I realized I couldn't remain silent any longer. My mother portrayed me as an enemy, an egotist, and a traitor, and the longer I stayed silent, the more people believed her words. I felt like I was losing not only within the family, but in the eyes of our entire town. Then I decided to take a different path, not with yelling or money, but with the truth. The first thing I did was recall all the times my mother had humiliated me. The words I'd endured as a child, as a teenager, at graduation, in front of my girlfriend at my first job. I wrote it all down point by point, because I knew that if I spoke spontaneously, my emotions might overwhelm me, and I'd be made to feel guilty again. I began to approach those relatives who were trying to pressure me cautiously. For example, with Aunt Linda. She again brought up the fact that I had abandoned my mother and made a laughing stock of her. I calmly asked, "Do you remember how she said in front of everyone that I would amount to nothing?" Do you remember how she laughed when my first girlfriend dumped me and said it would always be like this? Linda fell silent. I could see she hadn't expected to hear this from me. I didn't stop. I began listing one incident after another. How she forbade me to bring friends home because she was ashamed of me. How at school, instead of supporting me, she laughed at me along with the neighbor. Linda tried to justify her by saying, well, maybe she didn't mean it that way. But I spoke so confidently and consistently that her voice grew quieter and quieter. For the first time, I felt that the truth was on my side. Next was Uncle George. He came to me again with persuasion, but I didn't listen. I said bluntly, do you remember how she said I was a disgrace to the family? It was on your birthday when everyone was gathered around the table. You were laughing along with the others. Do you have any idea what it was like for me, a teenager, to hear that from my own mother in front of everyone? George recoiled as if I'd struck him. He felt uneasy, but he didn't say anything. And I realized the strategy was working. I started telling the truth openly and in public. The next time my mother caused a scene in church, I didn't just leave silently like before. I stood up and said it right in front of the pastor and the congregation. You say I abandoned you, but let's remember how you abandoned me with words for years. You said I was nobody, that I belonged on the sidelines, that I was a disgrace. You called me a loser in front of the neighbors. You laughed when I cried over my failures. You didn't give me a single kind word. So who dumped whom first? Silence fell in the church. People looked from me to her. Mom started shouting that I was lying, that it was all a fabrication, but for the first time I saw doubt in the eyes of some of the parishioners. They knew her character, and many remembered that she could really allow herself to do something like that. It was a blow for her. I went further. I started telling the neighbors the truth when they approached me with reproaches. Do you know why I didn't give her money? Because when I was 16 and brought home a certificate for my success in school, she said, so what? It doesn't mean anything. You'll never amount to anything anyway. Because when I worked nights to save up for a car, she said, you'll break it anyway because you're a one-handed person. Because when I wanted to go to college, she said, don't waste your time, you'll flunk out anyway. That's why. People listened and remained silent. Some looked away, others said, yeah, I heard how rude she could be. Gradually, her aura of victimhood began to crack. Relatives began calling less frequently. Some tried to stay away, others simply stopped interfering. But Mom didn't give in. She came to Julia and started a scene right at the gate, shouting that I had turned the whole town against her. But this time the neighbors came out to watch, and Julia calmly said, it's your own fault. You abused your son for 30 years, and now you're surprised he's turned away. People need to know the truth. These words were a blow to Mom. She left, but no longer with the same confidence. For me, this was the beginning of real revenge. I didn't give her a cent, but I took from her what was more important to her than money, her reputation. In a small town, people judge each other by words, by other people's opinions, and now her story was no longer one-sided. Now they knew my truth, too. That was more powerful than money or loud actions. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, I simply revealed what she'd hidden behind a smile for years. And the more people learned the truth, the more her mask crumbled. She tried to fight back, but every time she complained, someone would ask, did you really say those words to your son? And she couldn't find an answer. I realized that this was my true victory. After I revealed the truth to people, the effect didn't happen overnight. It dragged on, rolling in a wave that no one could stop at first, like a slow but steady breakdown of the scenes in the house where my mother was accustomed to manipulating moods and moving people around like pieces on a chessboard. At first, it was small things. Aunt Linda cut back on her calls to one, "How are you?" a month, and no longer showed up for family gatherings. Uncle George began to avoid talking about me at holiday dinners, and his laughter, which had previously teased me in my mother's presence, disappeared. It was truly hard to watch Michael, whom my mother had once encouraged and coaxed, now linger and walk away, unsure which side to take. He looked confused, and for the first time in his life, seemed to understand that there are things that can't be turned inside out by simply shouting. With each new encounter, another person left, and this wasn't a quick triumph. It was a gradual erosion, a long reckoning of the consequences of years of my mother building her power by devaluing me. The streets became quieter. The neighbors stopped pretending not to hear the gossip. Some said outright that it all seemed humanly bad, and that maybe I deserved a chance to be heard. It was both strange and comforting to watch the former accusers lose their zeal. because even they seemed embarrassed to repeat what they had once accepted as truth. My mother felt this acutely and began to act like someone whose last vestige of identity was being stripped away. She played on pity. She sent messages about her health, posted photos from doctor's appointments, attached medical certificates to letters to relatives, and wrote long, theatrical text messages about how alone and helpless she was, about how her children and neighbors were breaking her down. Many responded at first, but very quickly questions began to arise not only from strangers, but also from those who knew our house from the inside. People began comparing facts and memories, and with each comparison, the image of my mother as an indisputable victim cracked further. The hardest thing for her wasn't that no one stopped giving her money, but that the usual emotional support had ceased. No one called anymore so she could vent her anger. No one gathered around her the unfortunate roles she had played so skillfully. I saw how this rupture affected her physically. She looked tired, not from work, but from constantly scanning her surroundings for the next victim to manipulate. One day, I happened to see her on the church steps, sitting with wet eyes, but these weren't tears of repentance. It was the fear of being forever rejected. Her attempts to turn to the pastor for support ended with a refusal to actively intervene. The pastor said that family matters should be resolved within the family, but these words sounded different, like a gesture of equidistance, and this forever destroyed the support she had considered unchangeable. New conversations began to flit around the family. Linda confessed in a small circle that she had previously turned a blind eye to many things because she was afraid of a quarrel and didn't want to sow discord. But now that the truth had come out, she was afraid not for her mother, but for her own role as an accomplice. Uncle George, who always insisted that family was sacred, suddenly said a few words about how the truth can be bitter, but it must be acknowledged, meaning he'd stopped covering it up. These words were as devastating to Mom as the refusal of money. She lost her familiar support network, the one that allowed her to remain centered and manipulate the emotional chain. In response, she began to act differently. If manipulation had previously been a tool for material gain, it now turned into a desperate attempt to save face. She began relying on public scenes, theatrical displays of pain in places where she had previously been seen as a strong woman in charge. She would come to the supermarket with bandages on her arm, stage falls outside the store, call medical facilities and demand attention so that people would see and talk about her. But even this stopped working as it used to. For those who knew the context, such a spectacle evoked not sympathy, but fatigue and irritation. Meanwhile, I tried to remain neutral and not allow the situation to slip into extremes. I didn't want to be a judge or stage public reprisals. One thing was important to me, that my life no longer depend on her moods. At the same time, I observed how some relatives began to feel guilty, and it was difficult to watch people break down because they had taken a step back. I understood that defeating her manipulations shouldn't be a gateway to further suffering. I wanted everything to be fair, not bloodshed and revenge. Despite this, she continued to look for ways to hurt me. Complaints began to be written to the local newspaper, pitiful letters insinuating that I was an ungrateful son, that my million was a curse, and that I had abandoned my mother. The newspaper published her letter, but after it was published, several people wrote back, recalling instances when my mother had openly humiliated me in front of the neighbors. It turned into a miniature public trial, where everyone had their own version of the truth, and the longer the correspondence went on, the more supporters of the truth I was declaring sided with me. On the one hand, I felt relieved. My mother's reputation was eroding, and this was, in essence, compensation for the years when I was denied support. On the other, I began to worry. How far would she go to regain control? One day, she came to the house where I lived with a petition and leaflets, which she distributed to the neighbors. Her rhetoric was harsh and accusatory, and people didn't like it. Many simply looked away. Some asked me not to interfere in their personal squabbles. Her loneliness reached a critical point, and it didn't make me happy, but it didn't torment me either. I felt a strange mixture of regret and acceptance. Something else happened that indicated a profound change. My mother began to lose the attention of the younger generation in the family, who had previously listened to her as if she were the absolute truth. Now the children of her cousins were asking uncomfortable questions, and this was almost catastrophic for her, because it was the attention of the young that fueled her power. When relatives began to refuse her requests for loans and invitations to holidays, I realized that she was losing her last tool, public approval. The fear of this loss resulted in aggression. She began making harsh, unceremonious statements at family gatherings, accusing people of betrayal, and calling for help from those who still remained with her out of habit, not conviction. But habits are a weak foundation for long-term support, and eventually her circle narrowed to a couple of acquaintances who continued to visit her out of a sense of duty or fear. My mother began to change in appearance. She wore less makeup, wore simple clothes, and increasingly looked confused, like someone who suddenly realized they were no longer trusted. She constantly tried to find excuses, sometimes work, sometimes pressure from neighbors, but these excuses did not restore the lost sympathy. I knew this wasn't the end of the story, but rather the culmination of a long process. I didn't rejoice at her fall, but I saw that long years of invisible cruelty had finally found an answer. This answer was not expressed in money or revenge, but in the fact that she was no longer the center of the family universe, and for her, this was far more terrible than any material loss. I felt a complex mixture of freedom and guilt, and it weighed no less heavily than her attempts to drag me back. Deep down, I understood that if people turned their backs on her completely, it could lead to tragedy, loneliness, worsening illnesses, depression. But I also understood that returning her to her former position, where she was allowed to ruin lives and remain an undisputed authority, would be fundamentally unfair and dangerous. So I held firm, continued to help those in need, and watched as the small town gradually rebuilt its understanding of justice, not idealizing my mother, but also not turning her into a monster. This change was slow and painful, but it offered hope that after the destruction, some kind of restoration might come, even if not in its previous form. When people I knew began to behave differently, I realized the process hadn't simply continued. It had entered a new phase, where people who had previously lacked the courage to speak the truth out loud now felt free and acted together. Aunt Linda first simply stopped calling, then openly wrote in the family chat that she no longer intended to play the role of a cover and did not want to support the lie. This message became the signal that both my mother and those who had remained silent for so long had feared. Uncle George decided not to invite her to family dinner and explained it simply. After what had just been said, he didn't want to spoil the atmosphere and hear a scene. My mother came herself, stood by the door with a pie, but no one answered, and this was not only humiliating, it showed everyone how much the attitude had changed. Michael, once her rock, declared he was tired of making excuses for her to his friends and couldn't tolerate her manipulation any longer. He stopped answering her calls and visiting, and the loss of this young man was more profound than any material loss. Neighbors who had previously waved their hands and accepted her tears as normal began to avoid the topic, and some openly said they were tired of the spectacle and would not support behavior that destroyed people. At the supermarket, the cashier, accustomed to her tales of woe, served her without her usual pitying smile, and her mother noticed. For someone accustomed to feeding on attention, such trifles were much more important than money. She began asking for loans and assistance, but the answers varied. Some refused outright, others said they would think about it, and silence became a new form of punishment. Letters to the local newspaper began to appear. At first, she tried to garner sympathy through a complaints column, but after the article was published, several people responded with their own recollections of how she had humiliated me in front of neighbors and relatives, and these responses became a kind of public judgment. People who had previously remained in the shadows and were afraid to speak out now wrote responses and shared their memories, and the tone of the discussion changed. From unambiguous sympathy for her mother to skepticism and a thoughtful reconsideration of her past behavior. The pastor she turned to for support refused to intervene publicly, explaining that family conflicts should be resolved within the family. But this statement sounded like a refusal to my mother, because she was counting on moral and social support, not a neutral comment. People began to refuse her over small things, not inviting her to their holidays, not stopping by to see her on business, when before they would have stopped by simply to listen to her lamentations. On several occasions, those she considered friends declared they were tired of her manipulation and would no longer support behavior that was destroying family relationships. She began to feel isolated and betrayed, and this gradually turned to aggression. In response to closed doors, she began ringing louder, visiting stores with feigned health complaints, and presenting medical certificates, but people no longer responded as before, and her words lost their force. When she arrived at houses with leaflets and tried to distribute them to neighbors, many accepted them without interest and tossed them in the trash. For someone accustomed to shaping public opinion through pity, this was humiliating. Retribution manifested itself not only in whispers and refusals, it escalated into active actions. Some relatives began openly telling the truth at group gatherings, others discussed her behavior with employers and acquaintances, and gradually, a picture emerged in which her image of a victim was undermined fact after fact. I saw how it affected her physically. She wore less makeup, dressed more simply, and looked tired and confused. Her usual play on emotions no longer worked, and this aroused in her a desperate desire to regain control. Sometimes she tried to rally her old supporters around her, inviting those who might intercede for her, but many had already lost trust in her and did not want to become involved in family squabbles again. This was a severe shock for her, because the power she had built over the years was based on people believing her words and turning a blind eye to contradictions. Deprived of this support, she felt disarmed. This did not please me or give me satisfaction in the usual sense of revenge, because I knew that someone else's loneliness is always painful, even if you believe you have fairly achieved justice. Deep down, I was worried about the potential consequences for her health, because the economic and emotional support she had previously received had now disappeared, and this could lead to a deterioration in her condition. But at the same time, I understood that the past, where she had been allowed to violate human dignity, could not be returned, and that many people had finally stopped being complicit. I saw how some relatives were beginning to feel guilty, and this was also on the surface. They tried to justify themselves by saying that they simply hadn't noticed that her words were so hurtful, but now admitting guilt did not restore the lost trust. People's actions became more varied. One acquaintance stopped giving her money, another declared that he would no longer cover for her, a third simply stopped answering her calls, and thus her circle narrowed to a few people who remained close either out of fear or habit. She tried to involve official authorities, complaining that she had been abandoned and that her rights had been violated, but bureaucracy and formal procedures did not produce the results she was accustomed to. Complaints had little effect, further undermining her confidence. Sometimes I'd see her sitting in the house, staring out the window for long periods, and in those moments, I'd experience mixed emotions. Relief that my life was no longer built around her manipulations, but also regret at the devastating consequences for the person who had once been the center of the family system. I understood that what had begun as my defense, an attempt to reveal the truth, had turned into a collective rejection, with consequences for everyone involved. In a small town, such things take their toll. People remember, rethink, and sometimes make mistakes, creating new outcasts, but I maintained that honesty and boundaries were more important than comfortable silence. Conflicts continued to escalate, as conversationalists and behavioral educators sought to balance compassion and fairness, and I had to explain to those who asked that I wasn't celebrating her downfall, but I also had no intention of living under the dictates of someone else's cruelty. Ultimately, the shift in public opinion left her with a small circle of support, and it was time to decide how to move forward. Should I commit to a final break and abandon this person, or should I try to find a form of support that wouldn't reintroduce the old mechanisms of manipulation? I hesitated, but I understood one thing. Resolving the conflict would take time and honesty from everyone, and if there was a chance that people could build new relationships based on respect, that opportunity had to be seized, but not at the cost of my own selflessness and forgetting what had been done to me. After everything that had happened, I realized that the most powerful revenge isn't loud accusations or public denunciations, but simply cutting someone out of your life. Ignoring turned out to be a weapon far more powerful than any words. My mother always fed on reactions. It was important to her to see my anger, to hear my excuses, to feel that I depended on her opinion. But when I stopped responding, stopped looking in her direction, her power crumbled. I stopped answering the phone, stopped answering the door. It was hard at first. Every time I saw her number on the screen, the familiar wave of irritation and pain rose within me. But I forced myself not to react, and the longer this went on, the easier it became. Soon I realized that I could calmly scroll through her messages without reading them. I could drive past her house and not feel anything. This was a new state, one I had never known before. I began to help others, as if consciously demonstrating to myself and the whole city that my past no longer determined my future. I paid for a neighbor's medical treatment, helped my niece go to college, donated money to the local animal shelter. People saw it, thanked me, respected me. And every time they talked about my generosity, I realized it was the most painful blow for my mother, to see that I could be caring and generous to everyone but her. She had no way to counter this. She had grown accustomed to portraying me as an ungrateful son, and now that mask was crumbling. In a small town, you can't hide anything. Everyone saw what I did, and everyone knew that my mother was excluded from the circle of those I was willing to help. At first, she tried to fight it. She called relatives, complaining that I had crossed her out. Some tried to pressure me, saying, after all, a mother is a mother. But the more they talked to me, the more they realized that I lived a calm life, without hysterics or malice, and that this was precisely the sign of the truth. Gradually, even the most stubborn ones stopped supporting her. She became increasingly lonely. I heard that she tried to gather at least some kind of circle of acquaintances around herself, but each time it ended the same. Complaints, grievances, reproaches. People distanced themselves. At some point, I realized that her social circle had narrowed to a couple of old neighbors, who themselves were dissatisfied with everything in the world. And this was her prison, the company of people just like her, people who lived only by complaining. I had no part in this, and this is what broke her. The real revenge was that I stopped giving her fodder for manipulation. I didn't prove anything to her, didn't justify myself, didn't try to explain. I simply lived, and every day of my life was a reminder to her of what she had lost. This became especially obvious when I bought a new house. I threw a housewarming party, invited relatives, neighbors, friends. Everyone was happy, congratulated me, said I had made the right choice. My mother was not invited. I didn't even discuss it. I simply didn't think it necessary. But I knew word of the party would reach her. In a small town, news travels faster than the wind. And when the next day I heard she was hysterical because she wasn't invited, I realized this was the climax. She was no longer the center of my life, not even a part of it. And that killed her more than anything I could say. Time passed, and I became increasingly convinced that I had made the right choice. She tried several more times to break through the wall. She stood outside the house, left notes, even passed on requests through acquaintances to just talk. But I no longer saw the point. Her words had once burned me from within, but now they were empty. She screamed into the void, and the void remained silent. That was my revenge. I left her only her own echo. When we met by chance one day in the drugstore, I saw the way she looked at me. There was a mixture of hope and despair in her eyes. She waited for at least a nod, some sign that I still saw her, but I walked past. And in that moment, I realized it was all over. No big finales, no scandals, just silence. My life moved on, and hers was stuck where she left it. I didn't wish her death. I didn't make plans to destroy her destiny. My revenge was different, to show that you can live better than she ever imagined, and completely without her. She dreamed of seeing me miserable, broken, dependent on her opinion. But I chose a different path, and it was the best response to all her years of humiliation. Now, looking back, I understand. Ignoring me turned out to be the harshest and most just revenge. She gave me freedom and left her with emptiness. And perhaps this is the only ending that truly made sense.